Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to FM40k. I am one of your favorite hosts, maybe your least favorite, Tim. Today, I am joined by my co-host, Dan.
Hey, guys. How's it going?
Will.
I'm back.
John is out there taking down, or should I say piloting, the Dark Eldar menace down in Texas. And today, we're joined by a special guest, Peter the Falcon.
Hey, guys. How you doing? Caca! All that other bullshit. I'm allowed to say that? I'm allowed to say that on this podcast?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we get the little E-tag.
Peter's joining us for a special episode because we wanted to talk about stats, but we didn't want to be Stats Center 2.0. What we wanted to actually talk about is how you, as a Florida Man 40K listener, can use Peter's methodology and his stats and basically his hard work to make you a better player at little to no effort required out of you. So I'm going to kick it off to Will, and he's going to get us started with this thing.
Hell yeah. So, Peter, it's great to have you on. I have been a big fan of Stat Center when it first dropped. One of my goals actually is to end up on the show once things start getting back to normal. And I just kind of wanted to ask some personal questions about you and your hobby and how you got into all this. So
yeah. Okay. Well, I'm an open book. You can go crazy.
Fantastic. So I guess the first thing is how long have you actually been playing 40K?
I started playing 40K, I want to say about 13 years ago. It was just before my my first child was born. I was into like World of Warcraft. That was kind of my hobby outside of just like drinking with my buds. And my wife, and I did it a lot, both things. And my wife was like, "Hey, when we have Xander, it would be real cool if you found a hobby that didn't take up as much of your time." And I said, "Awesome. Well, I'll go find one." And I met a buddy at like a board game night while we were just having some beers, and he introduced me to Warhammer, and went over to his place, played a game of a fantasy battle. Actually, thought it was just the fucking best, and kind of took off from there, because when I get into something, I kind of go all in. So ended up buying an army, collecting, saw that there were a bunch of people playing Warhammer 40K about a few months in, was like, well, I guess I'm gonna have to do that too, and spiraled out of control after that.
And she thought it was going to be less time consuming than WoW?
Well, to be fair, it's back then it was less time consuming than WoW for me. Okay. Now it isn't, but at the same time, I also have a job where I can do most of it there. So
right. So what armies do you play? I mean, you can talk about fantasy too. I'm just very curious. I feel like an army that a person picks kind of shows their inner soul.
So when I was into Fantasy Battle, I played Lizardmen.
Hell yeah!
Both because of aesthetic and because of gameplay. Like they were very good back in like 7th edition into 8th edition. They did require a good amount of skill unless you were like just spamming slan magic. So I really liked them. They were fast, etc. And just like Incan or Aztec dinosaur riding dudes that are also dinosaurs, like I couldn't go wrong. So that was my army for that. When I got into 40K, I started with Space Wolves, because I was like, well, werewolves in space sound cool. When I got a little more competitive, I ended up buying into Tau, back when they could actually move around and do things. I know you could still move Tau, but like Jump Shoot Jump was just chef's kiss for me.
So good. Yeah.
And so I played that through most of 6th into 7th. I took a break for about a year and a half in 7th because of some things that happened. And then when I ended up moving to the Arctic, I had longed for Custodes to have their own army for years. Like when I first got into the game, I asked our LGS owner, I was like, hey, is there a Custodes army? Because I just read a bunch of the lore. They sound like super badass Mary Sues. I want to play that. And he was like, no, that doesn't exist and it'll never exist. So I bought a bunch of the 30K stuff and lucked out because, they decided to ship them over at the end of 7th into 8th. And now I've got a large Custodes army. I do also play Blood Angels and Death Watch. It isn't anything stats related or anything like that. I just like the look of the armies, and I like an army that's more close combat oriented more than anything.
Gotcha. So that's really funny because just to relate, my first army for fantasy was actually Lizardmen as well, and I got into it like right before the end times. So like, I feel you, man. Dinosaurs riding dinosaurs, super cool. Man, I dig it.
They did us dirty in the end times, though.
They did. They're trying to, I guess, course correct. I mean, I've heard Age of Sigmar is fun. I'm not going to venture into that place, but if they do redo Saurus and make them more dynamic, I might be tempted.
Yeah.
But so you actually made mention you picked a few armies that you enjoy just because you enjoy them, not necessarily informed by statistics. So is that something that is typical? Do you do aesthetics draw you more towards an army rather than like overall, win rate and things like that? Like, how do you make a decision on what you're going to play?
Like, for me, it is generally aesthetics and like the enjoyment I get out of playing them. I really I've loved Custodes when they were good and when they were bad, because their gameplay style, there's parts of it that I really enjoy. That kind of hero hammer, but not, where you can soak so much damage on a dude in a game, and he just doesn't die, and you have that story. Because often for me, because of where I live, I can't get a lot of competitive 40k games in. So when I do travel to an event, when it rarely happens, to actually play, I'm generally more interested in having a good time and making sure my opponent has a good time than winning the event any longer. So when I bring Custodes, and we have that game and that shield captain, survives, 3 tank commanders to the face or whatever, that's just a cool story that you and your opponent can just laugh about as it happens. Or if he gets dunked right away by a bunch of grots just pistoling him, and you're like, well, that's not how math works, but cool. It creates this this bond that's a little bit cooler than if I'm just out there with some my old dick stomping Tau lists, just dropping pie plates on everybody and not having them enjoy anything of it, right? So that's kind of that. There was a mentality switch for me once I moved away from where I could get consistent games in. There's still a competitive edge. I still try to refine these lists to the best of their potential. But I'm not as keen on, digging into the metrics specifically so that I can win, even though I think I can do that. It's not into it. I'm not into it anymore.
Gotcha. Okay. And there's nothing wrong with being a fluff bunny. I mean, at my core, I like fun narrative games too. It's just, I'd rather play competitive, but I get it. I understand.
So that moment, you can hear Will force himself to say that.
Yeah.
Okay. No, it's not true. I mean, whatchamacallit, my favorite sept is Sasea from Tau, and I tried to make it good once.
Yeah, don't do that.
No.
Sept is sept.
Sept is sept, exactly. But so you and Val do host 40k Stat Center, and I remember. After a couple of episodes, you started doing these deep dives on raw numbers, from different events and whatnot, different factions and how they're doing. What got you into statistics, and I guess what about the statistics of competitive 40k drives you?
Statistics as a whole, I used to do data analytics and collection for some pretty large companies at one point in my life. So I've always it's always been this thing that I just have done for work. When I had my career change about 4 years ago now, to get into air traffic control and services, I ended up moving to the far north. I didn't have a whole lot much better to do with my time, sitting in a lonely tower sometimes in the winter, not talking to anybody. And what ended up happening, I want to say it was January of my first year here. my wife and kids had just moved to join me. I'd been here for a few months at this point. I was sitting in the tower one night and I popped on a podcast during one of my breaks. It was Chapter Tactics. This was before I was on the show myself, and it was Val and Pablo talking about 7th edition 40k stats, and it was a whole episode based around best ghost pairings. It sent Val a big Excel spreadsheet for apparently like no reason, just like, hey, cool, look at what we can do now. And he had kind of dug into it on a very basic level and was like, and as I was listening to it, it surprised me. I couldn't understand how a game like Warhammer 40k didn't already have somebody or some group that was just collecting stats. And so what we had was this like very basic melange that wasn't curated. We had no idea how much of it was accurate or not. There was all this talk about, well, we're not quite sure what this means or what this means. And it was all stuff that, to me, as someone who'd done it for so long, was like, that's like the first thing you do is make sure that the data is accurate, and then and you curate it and you do all this extra work. And so I felt like maybe that's something that I could do to help the community, because I really love the Warhammer 40k community. It was a really big deal for me back when I was back home on the East Coast. A lot of my best friends are, I got to know due to Warhammer or due to 40k. And I just it's very rare for me to meet someone that enjoys this hobby as much as I do that I don't like. So I talked to Pablo about it, and I said, hey, this is something I do or used to do. If you like, I can start just collecting this data for you. He thought I was a big liar. And so for, I think it was BAO 2018, I dug deep and I collected like all the list data, unit data, everything over that weekend, and I sent it to him, and it kind of blew up from there. I just decided to keep doing it. I bought a website, started manning it because people seemed to be very interested in the data, and now here we are.
That's such a cool and like weird way to stumble into almost the spotlight, because I know when the show first dropped, everybody was listening to it. Well, everybody in Brohammer specifically wanted to strive to win events just to get on Stat Center. So
I'm going to jump in right there to brag. Yes. I was on the pilot episode.
Yep.
Like that's my claim to fame. Pilot episode. And then like I think 2 other times. So I love it, and not just for being on there, but just because that was one of the few competitive centric podcasts I could listen to and respect, if that makes sense. Like there's a few others out there, but a lot of people, they're very subjective, and I love the objectivity of the data.
That was like our 2 big goals, and you guys just kind of encompassed them. It was to be an objective podcast because, Val and I were part of Chapter Tactics at the time, which was often very subjective, right? Like they would use my stats. I would often like email Pablo or Jeff or somebody, like, here's all the stuff that happened over the weekend. But like it was very subjective how they even talked about like tournament results, etc. Like, we think this guy did it this way because of this, and they obviously weren't the only ones. Basically every podcast did that way, right? They would look at tournament results and be like, I don't know how he did it, but I assume it's this, or this list is bad. He must just play in a bad meta. So we really wanted to dig that down. And then the other big thing for us for StatCenter, and the thing I think that gave us both the most joy, was like spotlighting people who aren't in the spotlight often. So getting these, GT winners or top table players or even TOs from places that we don't talk about. Like when I started collecting stats, nobody talked about the Australian meta. Like that wasn't even a thing. And the first time I mentioned Australia on Chapter Tactics, I got emails in the morning from Australians being like, oh man, I can't believe you actually talked about us. Like that never happens. And that was really cool to me. And that meant a lot to get these people out there to show like this game is so big and it's everywhere.
Yeah. So you've been talking a lot about your data collection. How do you get it, or what do you use to get all of your raw numbers and then turn it into something that an idiot like me can understand?
So It's gotten a lot easier. When I first started, the game was still very disparate in terms of how we track data. So it used to be I would trawl Facebook. I would like go on Comp40k Facebook, Comp40k Reddit. I would go into, I would do like searches for GTs, and then I would use Best Coast pairings and Down Under pairings, which at the time wasn't as popular, but you could get Australian results from there. I would use Tourney Keeper, which was mostly for European events, and a couple others. So I had like 7 or 8 different areas I'd have to dig into every weekend to see if events were had. And then as it became more popular, I'd sometimes just get messages from people, and they'd be like, hey, we did an event in Scotland, because Scotland was the worst for this weekend, and we didn't advertise it. Here's our Excel spreadsheet with who won and who lost, and here's this like Dropbox with all the lists. And it was very time consuming back then to get this all done, but in the last year or so, most people have switched to either Best Coast pairings or Down Under pairings. So these days I just check both of those sites. I look for anything that meets my minimum criteria, a GT level event that doesn't have like a significant amount of drops in the first round, and then doesn't have too many like house rules. There are certain house rules that I'll allow, but I'll make sure that I note it so that you can filter them out. If you're like, this is a Highlander event, or this is a single detachment event, or something like that, then those ones I don't track because they skew the results too much. And then I put them all into an Excel spreadsheet because I want to keep it simple for everybody. I want everybody to be able to kind of manipulate the data, and that's kind of the most basic way to do it, rather than using Python or Tableau or anything like that, which I do have access to, and spit it out so that people can read it and do what they want with it.
That's well. So I mean that's really interesting. That's very cool. Bonus question: how long does that take you?
It takes me about at this point, it takes me about 1 minute per person in an event to track the data of an event.
That's a little time consuming. I mean, that's really cool though. It's definitely an excellent resource for the layman like me to utilize. And actually, that leads me into my last question for you is how, because you said that you get more like narrative driven games where you're at. But if you were to prep for a GT instead of covering it, because I know that sometimes you do commentary for these events, but if you were preparing for a GT, how would you apply all of the information that you've like found into playing that game? Like, would you how do I say this? Would you pick like the best army with like the best win rate, and then you would know how your matchup is going to go based on what faction your opponent's playing, who your opponent is, and like the different units that you take, or is that like way too involved for you?
So, like I said, I personally have kind of backed away to the point where I just want to play competitively, but I don't care if I win. So, like, I would try to find the best possible list from what I have available. I will buy new models. Like, if I see that there's a Custodes list that's doing extremely well, and it's something I feel like I'm very comfortable playing, like, I have no qualms with hopping onto Forge World or some Chinese website or whatever and buying what I need to make that list happen. Generally here, in a non-COVID time, when I would prep for events, because I have gone to a couple since I've moved up here, I would just like message the group of guys down here and be like, hey, listen, I'm going to an event. Is it okay if I bring my tournament list to the next game? They would get all excited generally and be super cool with it, and they would tech against it in their minds. But generally, the way I would play those games is less of a. It's more like I would play out scenarios in my head more than actually play against my opponent. Like in this scenario, this is what I expect my opponent would do, so I'm going to do this instead to counter that. In terms of statistics, like and the data itself, if I'm prepping for a tournament, I'm often looking at who's going to be there, what do they play. So, like, is there a surprise that I'm going to have to deal with? And then it's just like building out what seems to be working the best right now in the meta by looking at all of the lists, trying to figure out why it's working that way by actually talking to those people if I need to, and then kind of developing something that's functional. And after that, I play it. That's really it.
That kind of is a nice segue to the part I want to talk about, is how can our listeners, I know you said you didn't want to do it, but how could our listeners use your stats or go even deeper and use your methodology to scout the meta and refine a list? Is it something that I could just do with the BCP subscription, or do I have to actually reach out to these guys and go as far as getting them to send me Excel spreadsheets or stuff like that? Or can I just do a little bit of legwork on my own? And let's say, for example, I'm a budding competitive player from an RTT, and really I only go to RTTs in the 2 stores in my county. But I'm having some success, and I kind of want to take this show on the road and maybe start playing events in my region or my state. Or if I'm a more established competitive player and I want to, fly to a major in a few months, out in the Midwest or the West Coast or something, and I maybe want to look at GTs that all the local players who are going to go to that major, they've probably been going to those GTs and RTTs and running lists and doing stuff like that. I guess I would ask, that's kind of the scenario I'm thinking in my head. This is the person who would be asking this question. I guess I should say, is it even worth doing this? Obviously the best thing we can do is just kind of know what the meta is doing and get reps and kind of trust ourselves a little bit and everything like that. But it's just something I've always considered, doing this little bit of meta research and scouting, and finding out the meta firsthand with raw data versus waiting for it to filter down to us from Art of War or from the internet or from your buddy who always kicks your ass, that sort of thing. And just finding about it as it's happening with stats and with just simply a BCP subscription. Is it worth doing, or is the sample size too small, the regional level or something like that?
No, I think there's definitely some worth in that, particularly if you're looking at a GT level event. Often with major level events, there's enough travelers that if you just look at the broad overall, this is what's expected to win, stats, you should be okay. Right now, for example, or even if let's not talk about right now. Let's go back 2 months.
We'll get to right now near the end of the episode.
Yeah, let's go back 2 months. Let's say you were in a place that was allowing a GTs or majors, or you happen to be, or this wasn't happening and it was just going full tilt. You should be able to just pop in, take a look at win rates, take a look at tournaments and winning position, TWIP, and have a rough idea of what's working in the meta. And if you're going to a large major, if you're going to some kind of super major event, generally that's the stuff you're going to have to deal with. GTs tend to be a little more regional. There's not as much travel going to those, and those are ones where you can dig that extra step and you'll probably find important data that you need, using a best coast pairing subscription, using 40k stats. Something I've always wanted to do is add a geolocation feature to 40k stats. I've just been lazy and forgetful, because it would add that value specifically for that reason. Because if you're going to
cool.
say,
and I would say
Red Rock Exterminatus, a GT that happens in Utah, you should know that Richard Kilton plays in Utah. Richard Kilton only plays orcs. When orcs are bad, he is still a good player. So you if you haven't been thinking about orcs for the last several months because your meta or maybe the overall meta isn't very orc heavy, that's something you need to consider. Or Thomas Ekstrom-Oki, who plays Blood Angels. These are players that are consistently in the top 4s in their RTTs in the area. They consistently win, and so those are lists that you may not have considered that now you should, because chances are if you want to win that event, you're going to have to play these people. Same with the Midwest. If you what's Ben Sherwin playing right now? Is he sticking with Black Templar? Is James Kelling sticking with Elves, or is he moved over to Dark Eldar or whatever? There's all these things that really help you by looking at the stats, looking at who's top tabling these events, and just checking to see if there's any kind of differential between them and the current meta. Some places chase the meta very hard and it's a little easier. like I often use Sweden as an example of that. If you're for some reason traveling to like Games of Westeros over in Sweden, as long as the book has had an FAQ, chances are you're going to have to play whatever the hardest like stuff is in the meta. If you go over there, like half the guys there are going to be playing whatever the best thing is. So, and that's where that like going that extra mile will give you a little bit of a leg up, because you'll know, these are the things I need to break away from outside of, Drukhari or whatever is the current flavor of the month.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It was one of the things that a big part of the reason this whole episode we're doing this. I was kind of just when we were doing the last episode, Dan was talking about all the Necrons that he was facing, and I had noticed it too when I had set BCP to events and then set them to events within 300 miles. And I just noticed that the stuff I was hearing online about Necrons getting power crept out a little bit by the meta wasn't reflecting in what I was seeing in the 300-mile radius of where we were at. Necrons were podiuming very well, so I'm sure there's a little bit of meta/player skill, and then there's like RTTs, smaller GTs, stuff like that.
Yeah,
but it's kind of what got the gears turning for this sort of thing. For like, let's especially with COVID, where we kind of pre-COVID, it very much felt like the meta, quote unquote, was very much like a global or national thing that people talked about like it was a singular entity. And then with COVID happening, it was more like just like a series of lakes almost. Where they just didn't really. What happened in one, the ecosystem was completely different to another one. And maybe someone took an idea from another one and brought it over to another, but it was very much like a transplant thing versus a natural evolution.
Yeah, you're 100%.
So that's where I got the idea. But I guess like the last question to kind of close it out, and you kind of already dove into it a little bit, almost like you kind of like read my mind, but it's just if you are, because some people are very, they don't do the math, they go by their gut feelings, they just wing it, they have a list that they do well with, and they just play it no matter what. Maybe they adjust it if it stops working, but they just play what they play. They live their own truth. Other people are very much a slave to stats and math, and they keep close tabs on what's happening in the meta. And sometimes they'll adapt to the meta to their detriment, and they'll adapt for a meta that actually hasn't filtered down to whatever event they're playing in. And so I want to talk about like how to strike the balance when you're doing this sort of thing, is how to balance dealing with eliminating or mitigating hard matchups for your faction or list versus teching for like what's popular. Like, let's say I play X faction, and maybe I'm going to a major, maybe it only represents 5% of the player field, but it's going to be an uphill battle, almost a borderline loss if I don't take X unit for it, or 2 units for it. But at the same time, I had this other faction, and it's not necessarily a bad matchup for me, but it is a strong faction or a new book or something, but they're very popular right now, and I'm probably going to face them 2, if I get unlucky, maybe 3 games out of a 5 or 6 game event. And I guess I would just say, like, if you have any, just working with all these stats and everything, do you have any insight about how someone, if they're trying to use your stats and use your methodology and they're trying to take this research approach to refining a list for a meta, how do you think someone like that could balance that sort of thing? Like player representation versus win rate?
Sure. So yeah, I kind of touched on it with the making sure that you're going, if you're going, like, especially if you're traveling, because if it's local, you probably already know who you're going to be dealing with. Doing that extra step of checking the historicals, like either through 40kstats.com, through BCP, whatever, to see who's been winning events there and what they've been winning with, to look for outliers. And then in terms of like the overall meta, you want to tech for the outliers in like win percentages and TWIP, etc. as well. Like that's generally going to be your 2 things you want to look at. If AdMech are wrecking face across the world, like you probably want to know why they're doing that and have an answer for them, because some other dude may also be looking at the stats and is probably thinking the same thing and may bring them even if they wouldn't normally, especially at GT level event, because there's going to be at least one guy there that's going that route. And then on the other hand, it's What do the historicals say? What are people bringing there? Oh, there's a player there that's just an amazing Sororitas player, so I'm going to have to consider that. Or you're in a meta, like you said, where, man, Necrons are everywhere here, or Death Guard, or Dark Angels, which are 3 of the most popular factions right now. Even if they aren't performing very well at the top tables, like you're going to have to play those lists. And are you comfortable with enough with your player skill that you think, like, I'll just be able to outskill them at the table, and so therefore I really only have to worry about X thing instead. In terms of using the stats itself, one thing that I try to always recommend to people is don't just look at win rates, because they often tell the wrong story. You really want to go that extra mile. You want to look at things like tournaments and winning position, because these are the armies that are making it to the top table more frequently, and average first round loss. You can look at exactly when factions lose their first game, and that gives you an idea, if depending on what meta you're in, as to how many times you can expect to play in that faction if you're doing well at a tournament, but also like when you can expect to see them, if ever. And that helps a lot. If you know that, like, if you're very comfortable with your first game win or your second game win, but you know that, 30 or 40% of the time, once you get to that game 3, you have to play X faction, that helps you set up for success as well.
Awesome. That is very, very cool, and that's honestly kind of what I came for at this episode. So see you guys later. Bye. Wrap up the episode. I'm just kidding. No, it's really great, and it's really, really good insight. And I'm frantically scribbling notes, or at least I would be if my mic wouldn't actually pick up me writing. Dan, you haven't talked this much this episode. You want to lead us into this next part 3, and then we can wrap it up?
Yeah, of course. I was building Sisters of Battle Rhino, and if you've ever built Sister of Battle anything, it's a pain in the ass. So that's why I wasn't talking much. But I just finished it, so I will dive in. And basically, what I wanted to talk about a bit was just, like, kind of give you the opportunity to vent about stats when they're used incorrectly. Things like, if Chaos is doing really well, I know the Terminators, for example, are super popular down in Australia, but I remember listening somewhere where it was basically they can't buy the stuff that counters those Terminators because the distribution is so messed up, so of course they're going to do really well. So just stuff like that. If there's any specific examples you want to mention, or just this is your platform, Peter, to talk about all of the, like, common misconceptions and things that just aggravate you. If you feel like ranting, go for it. If it's something you're not super interested in, I can come up with something else. But yeah, so whatever you got, let me hear it.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I tend not to rant. I try not to. It's hard. Sometimes you do get that want. Usually, if I'm getting defensive, it's not because the stats are being used incorrectly. It's because they're being dismissed, which is a completely different story, right? If someone says, well, there's not enough data, it's my least favorite thing to hear, because very rarely when it's said, is it true. The beautiful thing about how stats have evolved in the last 4 years since I started collecting them is, like, we have access to so much more. Like, 40kstats.com is not the be-all and end-all. I only track GTs and majors, right? So particularly in a COVID time, there's often this assumption that when we're talking about metrics, we're only talking about GTs and majors. They're the only thing that exists, and if people aren't playing them, or if they're only being played in a very specific area, that the data doesn't matter. But it fails to take into account, like, all these other sources we now have access to, like the ITC Battles app, which, like, Goonhammer, myself, and others have been using to dig even deeper into, like, how the game is being played around the world. And that thing, because it involves allowing for practice games, etc., Garage Hammer, etc., it like really opens our eyes to how, like, the standard player of this game is playing it. So when we talk about win rates, we can often, back it up. We can say, yes, there's whatever 3,000 GT games that we have in this database. There's also 30,000 regular games we have access to as well that back up this data. So that's normally my biggest peeve. And normally, when you see, like, an online discussion, an argument happening that involves statistics, if I chime in, it's really only to just make sure that people are aware, like, there's more data than you think, or the data, like, we don't need more to start coming up with solutions to problems. We can use historicals and say, okay, as long as I have at least X amount of games stored for a particular faction, there's only going to be a plus or minus 3 or 4% in terms of win rate, a plus or minus, say, 5% in terms of T-whip, as to how good this faction's actually performing. Because the meta settles way faster than anybody, I think, assumes. It's been something I've brought up, for years now, is that there's this kind of misconception that it takes the meta months to adjust to a new book, and it generally takes about 3 weeks.
So go ahead and quantify that for us. I know we kind of, like, in our hearts, we know what that means when we say adjust or sell for the meta, but, like, if there's any way you can, like, actually, like, truly quantify that, like, or like an example or something, like, what does that really mean? And then also, before you go into that, I do want to just do a quick plug and say, I really love that you guys have been starting to use the ITC battles thing, because I know a lot of people like to try to hand wave that away as, like, oh, we can't count on that data because it's not controlled, or blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
But I personally think that if you have traveled more than once per year, COVID notwithstanding, more than once per year in a normal year for a GT or higher level event, for the purpose of competing, you are most likely in the top 1% of players. Not the top 1% on the ITC leaderboard, the top 1% of players in the game overall, in terms of skill and understanding and just general game knowledge. So to get, again, most people probably aren't casual. A lot of casual people probably not even aware of ITC battle apps, but you'd be surprised. So I do think it is important that we also think about the average Joe. Like, hey, is this the stratification of a meta? And if this is causing a problem for the average person playing in the garage, then yeah, that's something that we need to consider. But before I get off two track, if you just go deeper into quantifying, like, what do you mean when, like, a meta adjusts? Like, it's one thing to say a meta adjusts quickly, but, like, what are you seeing that tells you that a meta is adjusting and settling quickly?
So whenever there's a codex release or an FAQ release, there is an immediate impact to the game, particularly if that codex is strong, right? The weaker a codex is, generally you don't see anything. Like when a Space Wolf codex drops, which has happened twice now since I've started collecting data, there's no ripple effect. I've never seen it. They come out, they have like a 45-46% win rate, they stay there forever. But when a big codex drops, when you get an Imperial Knights from 8th edition, or you get like a Drukhari now, Space Marines 2.0, generally what happens is that codex drops, you see an immediate impact, and then if it's strong enough, it only gets better. The meta generally adjusts at the very top, where you'll see, like, the T-whip representation change significantly. You'll see, like, a spike in win rate to whatever that faction has, and then it normally doesn't dip. Like, it doesn't get worse. It'll either get better because more top-end players realize that this is the best way to win an event, so they will pick up that codex and start playing it, or the only players that quote-unquote adjust to be able to deal with these new lists don't have enough impact on the win rates, etc., to drop them in a significant manner. So you might see Imperial Knights come out with a 58% win rate when their book comes out, and you're like, wow, this is crazy. That's really good. And then 3 or 4 months later, they'll still sit at a 56 or a 57. They won't, like, and it's because the only people that adjusted are the very, very top end. Anybody else that has tried has either failed or still hasn't quite adjusted yet, because that's just how we play this game. And we see that time and time again. Whenever there's been a, like, quote-unquote problem codex, or even just a codex that was slightly stronger than the rest, the regression to mean, as we call it, it happens almost immediately. like you don't see changes to the statistics very often. I'm actually in the middle of doing up some data work with Goonhammer specifically on this, to see if we see that regression to mean on like an ITC battle app level. So like not the average player, because like you said, like people that use ITC battles app aren't necessarily like the casual group, but we have so much more data that we can kind of use that to see, does this mimic what we see at a G tier major level?
Sweet. I guess not just ventilation, but I also kind of want to see this segment for, are there any myths or any kind of like findings that have surprised you in, I'd say especially in 9th edition, any surprising trends or occurrences, or a lot of times you go out there, especially some of the older or more public forums, there tends to be like this kind of like conventional wisdom that a lot of times has not actually caught up to the realities of 9th edition, the reality of the meta. Like, oh hey, you're having problems with X faction, just bring X faction. Or you're having problems with X unit, just bring X unit. And it gets passed down by like some guy who hasn't played from 7th edition and doesn't really hold true anymore. I guess I would say, what are some hard counters or some strong matchups that like at least we all think on the online 40k community are hard counters or good matchups on paper, but aren't bearing that out in stat results? And I guess if you want to dovetail that into, are there any surprising like trends or occurrences that you've noticed in 9th edition, especially as we start to get like books and events start actually, safe events start happening with more regularity?
Yeah, so I think like there's a lot to talk about there. The faction versus faction stuff, oftentimes what we see people do is they'll look at like you said, they'll look at old data and they'll rely on that. And so you'll see things like, oh, like you're having problems with this faction, just take Plasma and Scepters with your Marines, because like Marines are still one of the best armies in the game. And that, for example, is just patently untrue. Right now, Marines are, as a whole, really bad. Like, with the exception of a couple outlier players doing decently well with, say, White Scars or like Iron Hands or Dark Angels, like the overall metrics for Marines, for the average Marine player, isn't holding up to anything in the meta. Like they're sitting at a sub 50% win rate. Their T-Whip isn't anything to talk about. Their average first round loss is generally well below a 2.0, which is kind of what you want to look for in a faction to think they're very competitive. So these are all things that you want to kind of look at and say, okay, like why is that happening, and why is that differ from the current belief in the system? There are also some factions that get kind of scorned, for lack of a better term, that fare extremely well, and we just don't talk about it, and we don't really understand why. A good example of this, I think, you were talking about Necrons earlier and how Dan was playing them pretty consistently, and you're seeing them podium quite a bit. But often when you read, like, say, a Goonhammer article, or you listen to certain podcasts, they'll say, like, their time has come. They can't compete. But they actually have one of the best records into Dark Angels and Death Guard out there of any faction. And
can't complain about that.
And when Dark Angels and Death Guard are about 25% of the meta, it makes it easier for like a good Necron player with solid play skill to top table an event, to win a GT, because like you can play into those factions and do decently well. Like in the last couple months, Necrons are 13-6 into Dark Angels, and they started out very poor into Dark Angels, but after a shift in how like the standard Necron list is played, that's flipped around. They're 13-10 into Death Guard. They generally play poorly into almost everybody else. But when your two best matchups are two of the most popular armies in the game, like that's a big help. Another faction that often gets looked at rather poorly but consistently does well is Orcs. And it's, I think, in the same vein as Necrons. If you have the skill level to play Orcs at a high level, the fact that orcs have 2 or 3 actually solid builds and people don't ever tech for them because they just don't expect to see them on the table, it gives them a surprising advantage out there.
Very cool. I guess the final thing I would ask about this would be, and this is kind of like more like a very kind of deep dive, and it might be a little bit out there, but if you notice factions, and we kind of talked about this with the settling a little bit, but if you notice certain factions take a sharp hit to their win percentage when maybe they're enjoying success before, but when a new powerful book comes out and they take a sharp hit to those win percentages, once the meta settles and they adapt, do they manage to adapt unscathed into the rest of the field? Or, like, let's say, I hate to use Dark Eldar as the obvious example, but, like, let's say, theoretically, let's fast forward, 6 months, whatever, and, like, for whatever reason, Marines have, via FAQs and point changes and Marines building differently or whatever, just, it doesn't really matter how we get there, but Marines have figured out a way to have a game into Dark Eldar. Mm-hmm. And we can replace those 2 factions with any factions. Do you ever see a situation where a meta has settled and a faction has adapted to the new big dog on the block, but that adaptation causes their win rate into other factions to suffer, and it never quite recovers? Is that something you've ever seen?
It's a really good question.
And I figured it'd be really out there to my blindside you, but I did kind of want. It was just something I was considering late last night, and I just wanted to think if we'd even thought about it.
I will say that overall, I don't think I've ever seen that happen. I have seen very explicit lists come out, not necessarily for the faction as a whole, but like an explicit list that will come out and will change, like, fundamentally how an army plays, and therefore it does have at least some impact on how they play into other factions. A prime example, even now really, that I think about it, when you look at their win rates versus other factions despite having really no changes to themselves, is Custodes. So Custodes in 8th edition, when they started out, were very much a foot and bike army. People caught on real quick to the bike situation, and it didn't really last. Plus, there were a couple codexes that came out after that were just much stronger than them. So they kind of slogged along for a long time. When the Castellan was eventually wiped out from the meta after numerous nerfs, Custodes saw about a 30% increase in win rate, because people realized that the Caladius Grav tank was real good when it couldn't be shot off the board turn 1. And that completely changed how Custodes played, because they weren't a vehicle army prior to that. And so what you saw was previously Chaos, Demons, Thousand Suns, armies like that had the best records into Custodes, because they could just mortal wound you to death and there was nothing you could do about it, and you couldn't slog through all their bodies. And that changed. All of a sudden, those armies didn't have as good a matchup because you couldn't mortal wound through whatever they were using for their screen before the grav tanks killed all your important stuff. And we're kind of seeing a similar thing right now, where Custodes started 9th as a predominantly foot army, and as this game has progressed, they have maintained a very good win rate, but not against the same factions, because they have moved to being a dreadnought heavy army. Where early on we didn't see very many Telemons, you'd see maybe one in a list. You're now seeing most competitive Custodes players running 2 to 3 Telemon dreadnoughts, 2 to 3 Galatis, maybe even an Achilles in there. They're going so heavy that it's very much skewing what actually works into their army, with the exception of Horde objective secured, which they often struggle against no matter what. But yeah, I guess that would be the only example I can think of off the top of my head where a faction has changed how they play, and therefore what plays well into them has changed.
Very cool. All right, well, I think that wraps up the kind of the main section of the show. So now we're going to go into that's my sound effects, the lightning round, where we're basically going to ask you about Just the more of the typical stat stuff that people always ask when they manage to corner the Falcon alone in the room. Captive audience here. I've actually done some tech stuff, and I have disabled his ability to leave the chat. So we have you. So let's start with. We'll go around the corner. We'll go Will, then we'll go Dan and myself. Will, anything about stats, faction versus faction, whatever. You get to put him on the spot and ask him. Go.
I guess I've got two that come to mind because I was primarily a Tau player until 9th edition, and then I switched to Guard, and I'm starting to play Dark Eldar now. But with your knowledge of how things have been in the 9th edition, is there a matchup, or like I guess is there a build for Tau that could potentially go the gambit, or are they like just too I guess dysfunctional to make it? Like, is there any like raw numbers other than Richard Siegler that you can cite for Tau?
Yeah, sure. So Tau suck real bad.
Yeah.
They have the second worst like overall statistics of any faction since the Dark Angels and Death Guard release, and they've essentially been either the worst or second worst since 9th edition launched. They just haven't really had much success. I believe they've had one person hit T-Whip since 9th launch, and it was a player that ended up getting DQ'd from the event.
Yeah.
So, but something that I guess I haven't really said on this podcast, but I've said it before elsewhere, like every statistic has a story, and even ones that you would often like immediately disregard, you should always look into, because like there's generally something there. That list that did hit T-Whip, that was eventually disqualified, very similar to the list that just came in second at a GT in Wyoming, which Tau haven't topped for it anything either, really. So that should lead you something. It's very similar to the list that Richard Siegler had been testing out on Art of War as well. This kind of combination of Viorla for your breachers and for the warlord trait, and then Farside enclaves for the fallback and shoot twice per game, with a Riptide with the ion accelerator, the relic ion accelerator. Like, that list seems to have legs. I don't think it can win an event. Maybe I'm wrong there, but it can go 4-1. So if you're like really desperate for how to play Tau, this might be it. It does rely on a couple, I want to say, it's not really gotcha, but like a couple gotcha combinations where you turn your breacher's guns into pistol. So you're sitting at pistol 3, and then you blow something away that your opponent didn't expect. You're playing a lot into Devilfish and Remoras, but it's a list it is the only list that's done anything for Tau.
Gotcha. When we circle back, I'll ask a guard question. Tim, you want to go next?
Why don't you go ahead and ask that guard question, and then I'll have my turn.
Sure. So the other thing is because I've been playing guard consistently, I'm going to be putting them on hold because I really do want to play Dark Eldar, not just because I want to win events. They're really cool. Mm-hmm. But I've noticed that whenever I go to events with guard, the one thing that I'm really having a super hard time with is unironically Necrons. If they get the first turn and they move up, the 6-inch pregame movement, they can lock me into my deployment zone. As a guard player, what are the percentages that I should know going into that Necron matchup that I'm probably going to lose?
Sure. So guard into Necrons right now. Necrons have about a 65% win rate into guard. It's been that way essentially since the Necron release. And it really is because a lot of the top guard builds are based around full payload manticores, demolisher tank commanders, and then bodies of some sort, whether it's scions or Deathcore Krieg riders, that kind of are supposed to overwhelm your opponent in the midboard. And Necrons are, like you said, already in the midboard, generally with more bodies than you've brought. A tank commander is not killing anything of theirs that's important unless they brought Silent King. and really neither is the full payload Manticore. So if you're like really worried about Necrons, if that's a faction that you really think you need to be able to beat to like take an event, then you really need to consider like, how do I kill 20 warriors in a turn and modify your list to be able to be fully capable of doing that, because that is the current guard problem.
Dude, it is so difficult to do that. I've actually that I don't typically do Math Hammer, but that was one that I did try to figure out, and it's like you have to roll really well with your 2 Manticores and still have the squad be over, I think, 12 models for a Wyvern, and then you have to have the reroll to hit for the Wyvern. If you can see them, it's even better, but like it takes all 3 vehicles just to get rid of 20 warriors.
Yep, and then they generally have 20 to 40 more. Yeah, I feel you.
Yeah.
Like,
you play into 60 Necron warriors and you end up killing like 100.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
it is a bad matchup for a guard. Like, it's one of their worst outside of, the factions that just generally do well.
Well, maybe I don't feel bad then.
Yeah.
So I don't really have any specific questions that I'm dying to know, but I do want to know, and then if you do have any results from so far from Dallas Open, definitely incorporate them here. We all know that the big boogeyman on the scene right now is Dark Eldar. We all know, like, we've all heard like their win rates, blah blah, blah, this and that. I just want to know, not so much how dire the situation is, but I want to see who is actually having success into them in an amount of numbers that's statistically significant. I think when you're talking the Bitbot Discord, like, you put up some stats and it was like, oh, this one faction won twice, this other faction won later, and then it was like 5 different factions that like won once. I'm like, okay, well, a sample size of 2, 1, 1, and 1, 1, and 1 across like 7 factions, whatever, to me wasn't statistically significant,
and it isn't. And that's why I whenever I talk when I talk in these terms, so I always make sure
Yeah,
this is how many games were played, guys.
100%.
But a lot of people are, when something like this happens, people are like very desperate for like, well, what actually works. So you have to be like, well, right now it looks like nothing, but this guy won a game, I guess. So maybe look there.
So I wanted to see, but also again, we said every stat has a story, and I want to see if maybe nothing that we can conclusively say is having success, but I want to say, and especially, and I guess you could also lead this back into the stats in general. Is there anything you've seen, especially as someone who's been looking at stats for, you've been working with stats for a long time? I would assume that you probably are kind of able to start seeing the signs of a trend beginning to emerge before like a normal person or a layman would be able to identify it. And now that we've had this huge, 175, 177 person event, in addition to the past couple weekends, we don't have significant sample sizes yet, but are you seeing the telltale signs of any trends starting to emerge? I guess I should say, and something that maybe, kind of like a watch this space, like, hey, we don't have anything that we can conclusively say yet, but keep an eye on these players, keep an eye on these factions, these lists, and maybe this is something where, for those people who are home, who are desperate, something that maybe you can like look to and just kind of keep an eye on over the coming couple weeks.
Sure. So yes, Drukhari are like particularly amazing. I've said it in a bunch of places. Their numbers are just shy of Iron Hand's release for like how powerful they are. We have enough games tracked where I don't expect this number to go down, or if it does, not to a point where it's still not 2 or 3 standard deviations above what should be expected for an army. If you look at, say, win percentages, in the past, pre-Space Marine 2.0, I would have told you that if you only look at win rates, if that's the only thing you care about, if you don't care about like how like the skew towards top end, etc., I would always want armies to be between about a 46 or 47% and a 53 or 54% win rate. Anything above a 53 was generally a codex that was already considered to be a little too powerful, or it had one or two builds that were too powerful. After the Marine Codex, where we saw power armor jump to 30 to 40% of the meta, that changed significantly. Then it became kind of a 46% win rate at the bottom end to 56 or so. Like what I was comfortable with as a strong win rate jumped a couple percentage points because of that skew. You know, Drukhari sitting at about a 71, almost 75 without the mirror. And then holding that at the Dallas GT currently. Like, they're 6 rounds in, and I believe last I looked, they were at a 74.5% win rate there of the 17 players that brought them, and a almost 79% once you remove the mirror matches, because most of their losses are happening in the mirror. All these numbers, they don't look great, but when you dive deep and you see, while no particular faction is consistently beating Drukhari, there are particular lists that seem to at least have a shot. White Scars, in particular, at a GT level, are now, I believe, 5-2 or 6-2, which isn't a statistically significant amount of games. But that's really it for a faction that is, you know, above a 50% win rate against them. So you kind of want to look at who's beating them. Is it the same 1 or 2 people? Is it the same style of list? And go down that road. There's a fellow there, Oliver Smith, right now. He won a GT last week where he beat kind of one of the Drukhari templates, and he brought that exact same list here. I believe he's beaten Drukhari twice at this event. His only loss was to Sean Naden, who's kind of running a mix of Drukhari, Inari, and Craftworld Eldar.
I can't really hold a loss to Sean Naden against the guy.
No. So he's running, 30 Vanguard vets with Lightning Claws, 3 Relic Contemptors with a double Volkite. That's essentially his list. And then a couple Land Speeder Storms, I believe. Not Storms. The Assault Cannon Melta one, I believe.
Yep. Another one, Jumbo.
So that's it's a very, very skewed list, obviously, because you're essentially running 3 units. But it seems to get the job done, and it has a good matchup into a lot of other armies. That Volkite Contemptor just does work against everyone because of the potential mortal wound output. So that's something I kind of look at. AdMech have had, while their win rate isn't good in Drukhari, they have had success at the top end. And so kind of looking at those lists and saying, what are they bringing? Is it anything different from the norm? Triple Scorpius Disintegrator is kind of like one build with a ton of Electro Priests. That's, I believe, what Mark Hertel is currently running, and he's 6-0 at that event. He's also pulled off a couple wins against Drukhari at a previous GT. And then you look at the 5 and 6 AdMech Bomber list, and I would look at that and then say, can I translate what those guys are doing to my own army? Is there a build I can make if you really are like, the only way I'm going to win anything is I have to be able to beat Drukhari? What are the aspects of those lists that I can carry into my own? Do I have a flyer that maybe isn't as good as the AdMech flyers, because those things are nuts, but do I have a flyer with a similar potential output that I could add to my list, because Drukhari generally don't have a good matchup into flyers? Do I have the ability to kind of flood that mid-board with a ton of bodies and a way to keep them alive, and get there before the Drukhari get there? Like, these are little things you can try to do, and that's really what I'm looking for now. What I'm looking for an answer for people that talk up Drukhari is like, are these things that we think work actually working? Are they only working at the highest level? And if so, how can we drill that down to the common denominator?
That was an excellent answer. I do actually have one question. I just thought about while you were talking. You said earlier in the podcast something that made me do a double take. You were talking about how Iron Hands is actually doing well, and I would love to hear about what those lists are, because I was actually looking through BCP last night out of boredom, looking through Iron Hands lists. And I just saw a bunch of stuff like kind of like the RTT level, and it was guys going like 2-1 or 1-2. It wasn't like anything like super crazy. One guy went 3-3, and I looked, it was a 1,000 point event, and I was like, wow, this closed BCP out of disgust. Because like right now, like I think, oh well, I can do a volcanic contemptor and I can name a character so he can't be shot. But then I try to build the rest of the list and I look at it, I'm like, this would be better as Ultramarines with Seal of Oath. So I'm a little curious there when you said they were doing well. It kind of piques my interest. What is doing well, and where is it doing well? What's it doing well into, and what do those lists look like?
Gotcha. Iron Hands are doing well purely from a win rate perspective. They generally lose their first or second game, and then they don't go further. But they'll win the rest of the matchups in that event. They're sitting at about a 53% win rate, which is significant until you look at like their T-Whip and stuff. The reason why I bring them up is because no other Space Marine faction is over a 50% win rate.
Okay. So they're like a mid-table assassin.
Exactly,
like
and it's because of things like
assassin.
it's because of things like untargetable dreadnoughts or like severe skew, like triple Leviathan, with like an untargetable contemptor mixed in, and then like a handful of bodies, and then you just hope that you don't meet up with somebody that can like weather that storm. Iron Hands, like at the top end, aren't performing. It's the fact that they can take that first loss and then kind of submarine themselves into a decent position.
Cool.
Where,
well,
like, other factions just aren't. An example would be if you want to look back to like March 27th, like the end of March, there was a fellow playing Iron Hands that did come in fourth at an event there. So he did top 4, which is generally something we don't see. So
sweet. Well, that was actually that was all I had. Dan, I'm going to toss the baton to you for the lightning round, and after the lightning round, why don't you go ahead and close us out? We can let Peter get back to his nest.
Yeah, so I really I just had one kind of question, talking point, whatever I wanted to touch on, and that is, do you feel, is there any type of a data skew, like the rich get richer type of situation, where an army's doing well, so all the top players kind of gravitate towards that one or two armies? So of course, the better players playing that army, the win percentage is going to stay higher, and then inversely, like Tau, nobody is playing them, so the people that are playing them are probably more casual, just looking to have fun, so they're going to be even worse statistically than they probably should be. Do you feel, is that something that occurs, or something you take into any type of consideration, or not, I guess?
Yeah. No, it definitely is something that occurs. It's generally something that you would see in smaller sections like of the data set. And by that I mean like if you only pull specific like date ranges. So like there's all these when you switch from statistician to analyst, there's a lot of things you have to take into consideration, because you can't be both at the same time. Like I can't collect the stats and try to analyze them while I'm collecting them, because it'll lead to bias. So what I need to do is I always have to shut off my mind, collect the stats, and then afterwards look at them and try to create hypotheses as to why certain things are happening, and then dig deeper, just for like a litany of reasons. Occasionally you'll have factions that perform decently well or really well, and then they'll just drop off, and it's not because anything changed. It's not because anything changed in how they play. It's just people have moved off of them because they're chasing a different dream, or because the top end players aren't playing them or haven't been to an event, like the guys that would normally carry that faction. A prime example right now is Ultramarines. Ultramarines, I believe I mentioned earlier, have like the worst statistics of anybody, and I don't think that carries when you do any kind of analysis outside of this last like 2-month period. They have all the tools to at least be a mid-tier army, but people have dropped them for Dark Angels, they've dropped them for Death Guard, they've dropped them for other Marines that they think will perform better, and you can map that out by just looking at the current players versus the previous ones, and like that is something that I personally can do. It's not something, unfortunately, just like due to certain world laws, I'm allowed like to let everybody do, unless you want to trawl the data yourself. But you can look at that and say, okay, well, X percentage of people just dropped this completely and are now moved on. So all that's left are the people that just like really love the faction, or the 1 or 2 players that were really carrying them because they were able to attend a bunch of events haven't shown up in the data in some time. And that's where the data analyst can come in and make those checks. And Ultramarines is like a perfect example, sitting at a current like 30% win rate, when they used to be, in the high 40s, low 50s with some actual TWIP representation.
Yeah, that's basically like the perfect answer. And it also brought up something I'm glad you said. I wanted to get to it before the end of the episode and kind of forgot, is there is absolutely a difference between statistician and analyst. And I feel a lot of people, and we talked about this earlier, but they'll kind of skew the data to fit what they want and their analysis instead of actually being objective again, and this is what the data is telling me. Now we can analyze why it is that way, but it's important to keep those things separate. Yeah, it is. Like when you guys told me to kind of go off on my rant, it was something I didn't mention, but it is a big deal, and it is something when I see it, I try to correct it when I can. Is this concept of only looking at the stuff that I like. And it's something everybody does. I have bias, and it's something I have to acknowledge before I dig into anything. I kind of just do it like unconsciously now because I've been doing it for so long. But there's definitely been times where I've been looking at data after I've collected it and been like, this doesn't fit my worldview. So what should I do about it? And you have to stop yourself and be like, it doesn't matter if it doesn't fit your worldview. Like, this is what it is. Try to answer why without making excuses, and then move forward. I remember the worst time it came for me was when Custodes first had that big lift for the Caladius, because I, as a big Custodes fan, as a big fanboy, when you see Custodes hit like a 60 some odd % win rate, which is always troubling, but if they're your favorite faction, there's part of you that wants to be like, I need to make an excuse for this rather than just acknowledge that there's a problem here. And we see that now, right, with Drukhari. There's definitely players that won't acknowledge there's a problem because it's their favorite faction. Yeah,
rather than dig deeper, right?
I see that so much. Like, oh, you just have to learn to how to beat them. Let the meta settle. And like you said, it's been over 3 weeks. We got the FAQ. They're still sitting at that same percentage. To me, the meta is settled, and there's a problem with that book. And some people try to argue otherwise, like you said, because they have the bias. It's their faction, it's their baby, and they want to do well, but they don't. They're usually the ones that make fun of power gamers and try to say, oh, well, you're just meta chasing, and now that their army is good, oh, I'm not meta chasing. It's not that broken. It's very much they're defending themselves when it really is like it's a broken faction. Just accept it and play the game.
Yep. I want to go on record saying I'm a Dark Eldar player. They definitely need to nerf. They need to be reeled in. This is not healthy for the game.
Yeah, and this is a cycle. We've seen it every time. There's been a codex that's been too good. Even when factions have been just like a little too good, there's this need to like defend your army, right? Because you don't want it to be nerfed to the ground. You don't want all this time or money that you've spent to be wasted. So I get it. But we always need to look at these things objectively. And it's very hard to do. It's very hard for like your average person to do. Not that I'm above average by any means, but like if you're not deeply connected to the data part, it's really hard to separate yourself. So you want to make these excuses. And I know a lot of very smart people that say, the meta will adapt, the et cetera, et cetera. And it's just like, at least from my perspective, something that's not going to happen. I also tell everybody, like when I have these discussions, I am super okay with being wrong. Like there is nothing I want more than like 2 weeks from now to look at a Drukhari win rate that's like at a 57%, which is still high, but like not broken high, and be like, I guess I was wrong. When 9th edition dropped, without any data, I was like, it looks like AdMech are going to be ridiculous. And then they got a points increase, and they just really weren't until now. It's only in the last like month or so where they've really hit their stride again. And I was wrong. I mean, that one at least wasn't data driven, but like there's definitely, it's just, we need to approach things better. Day 9, who is a guy that I have a great respect for because he is a mathematician on top of everything else. He once had this really good talk about online arguments and discussions and mathematics. And he opens it up by saying, the thing I love about math is you can go anywhere. If everyone involved is into the math, you can drop a formula and say, hey, I did this research, this is what I found. And as long as the rest of the people in this discussion are also mathematically inclined, they can look at that formula and say, oh, cool, give me a second. They can verify that number and then come back and say, hey, when I look at this, though, it does this. And it's all objective, right? There's no need to be right. There is just, here's the numbers. Like, can you corroborate them? What does that mean? Whereas when we get into like an online battle, sometimes there's just too much of a need to be correct. There's too much of a need for my army to not be broken. And so we don't have a proper discourse. We just have, well, we didn't do anything to Mortarion when he dropped, and he was broken, when there's no numbers to back that up. Or we didn't do anything to Blood Angels, and everyone said they were broken, and they're fine now. But there was never any numbers to back up needing to do anything to them, right? So that's kind of where I come from, where I just wish everybody was a little bit more objective about things and we could have a proper discourse and say, yeah, there's probably something that needs to be done. I'm super cool if that means we have to wait. I really wish we didn't, because I don't think that helps anybody, but at least have a proper discourse.
Yeah, that's pretty much perfect. And that's the other thing. There's always shock value when new rules come out. You see something, you read it, mentally you can really exploit, okay, yeah, under these conditions it's going to be 100% of the time like the best thing ever. But those conditions aren't always met. Kind of the skew and the balance is when that optimal condition is fairly easy to meet. And to me, that's when you start getting it in the data. Because as a Chaos player, I can come up with these scenarios where I've got the strongest army in the game. But if it only happens once every 3 games, I'm not winning a GT with it. Drukhari, in this example right now, feels like they can manufacture that win condition just very consistently, and the data shows. So that's kind of, to me, the discussion is where you can have multiple things that look broken, but they aren't all broken. And you'll find that in the Broviathan list, where you math it out and it looks bad, but then you play it against it and realize it was so much worse. It can go both ways. So I think we're at an hour and a half recording right now. I could probably keep going for another hour, but I know you've got other stuff you have to take care of, Peter. I'd love to have you on again if you ever want to. Will, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this information with us, Peter. I greatly appreciate it. It was fantastic talking to you.
Well, thank you for having me. Like, it's a pleasure. I always love talking, about the math, about everything. I can talk about literally anything. You can get me on for a lore show, and I'd talk that too. That's fine.
Right on.
Perfect. Well, if there's anything you want to plug, go for it right now, or just anything you want to say, any last thoughts. Once again, the floor is yours.
Sure. Everybody wants 40k Stats Center to come back. I can tell you we're looking at a mid-June launch for 40k Stats Center 2.0. So you can expect that to be broadcast to your brains in about 6 weeks' time, hopefully, if everything goes to plan. You can also hear me on the 40k Adjacent show if you don't really care so much about actual strategy talk, although we sometimes do that. I'm way more interested in talking about Angela Lansbury and complaining about life on that show. It's definitely my favorite thing to do at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. And otherwise, yeah, just check out my website, 40kstats.com. I don't need your money, but I love your eyeballs because it's important. It's important to stay knowledgeable of about what's going on out there.
Yeah, but if people do want to donate, you do have like a Patreon, or you have something set up, right?
Yeah, I do have a Patreon. I don't really plug it anywhere. I guess I am now.
Yeah, I'm making you
now.
do it. Damn it!
Yeah,
I love what you do. I want it to keep going.
I've like the funny. I hate this because I'm very self-defeating about it, but like this will keep going really no matter what until someone does it better. That's always what I've said since I got started. Best Coast Pairings have done some excellent jobs, an excellent job in kind of really pushing the stats. And once we get to a point where they can dig into the nitty gritty just a little bit more, there probably won't be a need for me. That's the hope someday. But for now, I'm this Joe in the Arctic, and I'll try to keep you guys as best informed as I can.
Well, I know I've used your data pretty much as soon as it started coming out. I absolutely love it because that's just kind of how I analyze too. So once again, thank you for everything you do, and thank you for coming on the show with us. And we will talk to everyone in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.